small town nestled deep in the woods, there was an old abandoned house that the locals had dubbed the Doll House. It was said to be haunted by a cursed doll that had terrorized anyone who dared to enter its walls. Legend had it that the doll was once a beloved toy of a little girl who tragically died in the house many years ago. The doll was said to have been possessed by the girl's vengeful spirit, seeking revenge on anyone who disturbed her rest. One night, a group of curious teenagers decided to test their courage and explore the infamous dollhouse. They had all heard the stories of the haunted doll, but they brushed off the warnings as mere superstition. As they entered the creaky old house, a sense of unease settled over them. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to whisper with the voices of the dead. In the dim light of their flashlights, the teenagers could see that the house was littered with broken toys and dusty furniture. But what caught their attention the most was a small porcelain doll sitting on a shelf in the corner of the room. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, sending shivers down their spines. As they approached the doll, they noticed that its once pristine dress was torn and stained with what looked like blood. Without warning, the doll's head snapped towards them, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The teenagers screamed in fright and tried to run, but the doors and windows of the house had mysteriously locked shut, trapping them inside with the cursed doll. The doll's porcelain face twisted into a sinister smile as it began to move on its own, its joints creaking unnaturally. It floated towards the terrified teenagers, its tiny hands reaching out to grab them. One by one, the teenagers fell prey to the doll's vengeful wrath, their screams echoing through the empty house. As the last teenager tried to escape, he felt a cold hand wrap around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He turned to see the doll looming over him, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly fire. With a final shriek, the teenager was consumed by the darkness, his soul forever trapped within the cursed doll. The next morning, the townspeople found the abandoned dollhouse shrouded in an eerie silence. They could sense the lingering presence of evil that permeated the air, and they knew that the cursed doll had claimed yet another victim. The house was sealed off, never to be entered again, for fear of awakening the vengeful spirit that dwelled within. Years passed, and the legend of the hunted doll faded into obscurity, but the dollhouse remained a grim reminder of the horrors that lurked in the shadows. And deep in the woods, the cursed doll waited patiently for its next unsuspecting prey, its glassy eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the abandoned house, a chill ran down my spine. The decrepit building stood isolated in the middle of a desolate field, its windows shattered and its walls crumbling. It had been rumored to be haunted for years, a place where spirits roamed freely and the echoes of past horrors could still be heard. Despite the warnings from the locals, my curiosity got the better of me. Armed with only a flashlight and a sense of adventure, I approached the house with caution. The front door creaked open as if beckoning me inside, the darkness within swallowing up the feeble beam of my flashlight. Stepping over the threshold, I felt a sense of unease wash over me, as if the very walls were watching my every move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way through the dusty corridors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant creak or rustle. It felt as though I was being watched, as though unseen eyes followed me wherever I went. I came across a staircase leading up to the second floor, the steps rotting and splintered. With a sense of dread, I began my ascent, each creak echoing through the empty house like a sinister whisper. As I reached the top, a sudden gust of wind extinguished my flashlight, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled to relight the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. When the light flickered back to life, I found myself in a dimly lit hallway, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. The eyes of the long-dead occupants seemed to follow me, their expressions twisted in agony and despair. I moved cautiously through the hallway, my footsteps echoing ominously in the empty space. Doors lined the corridor, their rusty hinges groaning as I pushed them open one by one. Each room held its own macabre secrets, from blood-stained mattresses to decaying furniture. It was as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent presence that reveled in my fear. With each passing moment, the feeling of being hunted grew stronger, as though some unseen force lurked in the shadows, waiting to pounce. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the clutches of the haunted house. But no matter how fast I ran, the walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in their suffocating embrace. Suddenly, a piercing scream rent the air, echoing through the house like a banshee's wail. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was my own voice, torn from my throat in a moment of pure terror. The sound seemed to awaken something sinister within the house, a darkness that seeped from the very walls and floorboards. I could sense the malevolent presence drawing closer, its icy breath caressing the back of my neck. With a final surge of adrenaline, I burst through the front door, fleeing into the darkness of the night. As I looked back at the haunted house, I could swear I saw the shadows stir, as though something ancient and evil had been unleashed. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me, my dreams plagued by visions of a house that hunts its prey with cold, merciless intent. The whispers of the spirits linger in my ears, their words a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk within the abandoned walls. And though I have tried to forget, the haunted house will forever remain etched in my mind as a place of unspeakable dread and unrelenting terror. It was a dark and stormy night as Sarah drove down the deserted road in the middle of nowhere. The rain pounded against the windshield, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. She had taken a wrong turn, and now she was hopelessly lost in the maze of winding roads that seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction. As she drove, her phone suddenly lost signal, leaving her completely isolated and alone. Panic began to set in as she realized she had no idea where she was or how to get back to civilization. The only sound was the howling wind and the eerie creaking of the trees that lined the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the darkness. Sarah's heart raced as she continued to drive, desperately searching for any sign of life or a familiar landmark. But the road seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in on itself like a nightmarish labyrinth. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the suffocating feeling of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. Suddenly she saw something that made her blood run cold, In the distance, she could make out the faint shape of a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was too dark to see clearly, but she could tell it was tall and slender, with long, ragged hair blowing in the wind. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. As she drew closer, the figure seemed to flicker in and out of view, like a ghostly apparition. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it a trick of the light, or something more sinister? As she got closer, Sarah could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothing that hung off her emaciated frame. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, staring out at Sarah with a vacant, soulless gaze. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. This woman was not alive. Terror seized Sarah as she slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt, just a few feet away from the ghostly figure. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she stared in horror at the woman standing in front of her. And then, without warning, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream that pierced the silence of the night. Sarah's hands flew to her ears, trying to block out the sound of the woman's wails. But it was no use. The screams seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. She could feel her sanity slipping away as the sound enveloped her in a suffocating wave of terror. Desperate to escape, Sarah threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, hoping to flee from the ghostly woman and the nightmarish road. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw to her horror that the woman was no longer alone. Dozens of other figures had appeared, shimmering in and out of view like phantoms in the mist. The road was now filled with the ghostly forms of men, women, and children, all dressed in tattered clothes and staring out at Sarah with empty, hollow eyes. They reached out to her, their fingers brushing against the car windows as they moaned and wailed in a chorus of anguished cries. Sarah's screams joined theirs as she realized the truth. This road was a gateway to hell, a place where the missing souls of the lost and forgotten wandered in eternal torment. And now, she was trapped in their endless purgatory, doomed to join them in their never-ending agony. As she drove faster and faster, trying to escape the horde of ghostly figures that surrounded her, Sarah could feel her mind slipping away into madness. The road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in on itself like a nightmarish maze that had no end. And then, without warning, the road vanished beneath her, leaving Sarah plummeting into the darkness below. As she fell, she could hear the screams of the lost souls echoing in her ears, a cacophony of horror that followed her into the abyss. And as Sarah's consciousness faded into nothingness, she knew that she would never escape the haunted road, doomed to wander its twisted paths for all eternity. And so, the legend of the missing road claimed another victim, swallowed up by the darkness and lost to the world forever.